Podcasts are...
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And for our fourth segment of the day here on the show, we're going to be looking at a wide receiver position, my third positional rankings of the week, and yet another highly volatile position. It's a position that, week in, week out, sees these established stars maintain consistency, sometimes fall on their face a little bit, but also these unsung heroes really make a name for themselves by matchup. And not for nothing, I feel like this position is going to get the most production. It's going to be the most monitored in these next couple weeks from a fantasy perspective. So you're going to want to be ahead of the curve in making decisions about certain receivers on the stretch, because either they're going to perform for you or they're not. Because let's face it, all of these teams, no matter their standings, feel like they can get the best out of certain players. And thus, you're going to have to go with the unpredictability of that. Whether you have established stars or guys who you either picked off the waiver wire and are waiting for, or some guys who are your secret weapons, so to speak. So, these four guys all could be in that superstar region of wide receiver, that superstar tier. But it's all going to depend on A, the nature of how their team's season goes, and B, their importance, because that's what's sticking out to me. Different teams in different situations are relying on certain performances and certain players specifically to stand out, while others, are just getting the best out of what they have. And so that's why it's so hard week in, week out to come up with a wide receiver. But these four, based off matchups, based what I think of them, and based off their performances in the past, all can perform for you this week specifically. Now further, let's talk about them. Starting off with, I believe, a repeat guy from last week's list. And I'm promising you yet again, whenever I talk about the Seattle Seahawks, this is not biased. DK Metcalf going up against the Jets. Only at 9.9 fantasy points versus Arizona. He kind of has taken the backseat a little bit to Gino's new favorite target, JSN. But in this matchup, I feel like all the Seattle receivers are viable. And DK is a physical guy. This is going to be a matchup that I'm really monitoring. Maybe not, shadow report worthy. We'll talk about the shadow report tomorrow against Sauce Gardner. But I just feel like this is going to be his game. Because if they can get DK Metcalf going, this receiving core suddenly becomes very scary. And it's something they're going to have to rely upon on the stretch, because their run game is anemic, to say the least. Their offensive line cannot necessarily run protect as they can pass protect. And so that's why I feel like, all of these Seattle receivers are going to be so important on the stretch. They might be the most important position group in all of the NFL because of their importance to their overall team success. So look for them week in, week out to interchange in terms of who I think could come out as the top receiver in this unit. And so this week, I'm going to pick DK Metcalf, even though JSN has truly shown in these past couple of weeks for Seattle as well. It's just that this matchup, his physicality, is going to come through, and it's going to really, really show up against this Jets pass defense. Then the next guy that I want to talk about had a kind of quiet, disappointing night last night. And I don't necessarily think it was his fault. It's just that in terms of how this game flowed, it didn't necessarily seem like he would have to be as important as he turned out to be. Because of the fact the Chargers did go into the downfield pass game a lot, this guy really should have had better production than he did. And it's not an indictment of him. It's not an indictment of this Chargers offense at all. It's just that this guy was someone who was seen as the new downfield threat for them. And in that situation, didn't necessarily perform to the best of his abilities. But I can't necessarily put the blame on him. And now this week, going in with some much less dominant pass defense. Even though the Ravens to that point weren't necessarily as dominant in pass defense. But it was made easier because of J.K. Dobbins' absence. So I'll give him that. Look, it's a much less dominant pass defense, though, in the Falcons. Quentin Johnston's going to have a nice day. Obviously, Justin Herbert's going to have to step up. And potentially, his new favorite target's going to be Ladd McConkey because of his timeliness in terms of moving the chains for this Chargers team. But I feel like, Quentin Johnson is still one of those players who can exploit certain coverages, certain teams, and also dominate as well. So we get a comment here from Mr. George Play 01. And he's a new viewer, I believe. Welcome to the show, George. Hope you are enjoying it thus far. And he's asking me a question of his fantasy team. Sup, man? I'm 9-3, first place non-PPR league. Should I trade JSN and Bucky for Henry? My running backs are Barkley, Jahmyr Gibbs, Trey Benson, and Jordan Mason. His wide receivers are DJ, Marvin Harrison Jr., D-Hop, Waddle, and Amari Cooper. And I feel like at this moment, I don't think this trade should go through. And here's why. I feel like your team is predicated on depth. I like the depth of both your skill position groups here. They may not be the biggest household names from a fantasy perspective, but they can get the job done. They're very complementary to each other, and on any given day, consistency can reign supreme with them, and that's the reason why I believe you're 9-3. In terms of those two players, JSN and Bucky Irving, they are not necessarily better than Derrick Henry separately, by any means the imagination, but together, combined, they are a very powerful thing because of the fact that JSN's being utilized more in the Seattle offense, and Bucky Irving is someone who has really been a revelation for the Bucs, even with those big guys in the receiving core in the fold as well. So look for those two guys to really shine for you. And while Derrick Henry's a special player, it's going to be more about these complementary pieces, these secondary weapons for you that you feel can be interchangeable in your fantasy roster. So for now, I'm actually saying no to this trade just because the individuality of Derrick Henry right now doesn't outweigh what I think of JSN and Bucky Irving, if that makes sense. Hope that helps, and I hope you continue to enjoy life in first place in fantasy, my friend. But I hope that helps most importantly. But getting back to these receivers, Quentin Johnston, I feel like, is someone who's going to be a no-brainer next week against the Falcons' pass defense that I don't think will be able to cope with him. But then another receiver who had a decent day, I guess, against the Cowboys, but is someone who week in, week out has shown that he can be a little more volatile than we think, even though this has been a career year for him. Terry McLaurin. I feel like we need to see more out of him. He did have, like I said, a decent day at best against the Cowboys by his standards, 21.2 fantasy points. But in this kind of struggle period for the Commanders, going up against a very feisty Titans team, especially on the defensive side of the football, Terry McLaurin is going to have to really step up. This is the number one pass defense, surprisingly, for the Titans. And so, while I think it's safe to say the Commanders now are going to try and make life simpler again for Jaden Daniels, I feel like the best parts of this offense are going to come from what Jaden Daniels can do downfield, no matter the risks you have to take with that. Because of the fact that Terry McLaurin's a special receiver, and because of the fact that he now has someone who's willing to get him the ball in certain situations. And thus, that's why, even though it does not look like a simple matchup for Terry McLaurin, because like I said, the surprising number one pass defense in the league right now, he is someone who, in this situation, knows what is going to be asked of him, and knows that his team is going to need some big plays from him. Because if that doesn't happen, then there's room for stagnation for this team. And I'm not necessarily saying they shouldn't employ and utilize different players like Austin Eckler, like their running back room, but I do feel like the best moments come from experimentation downfield with Jaden Daniels and Terry McLaurin. Because if that connection isn't growing continuously, then if the playoffs come and they find themselves in a situation where they have a chance to knock off a certain team, then that could be messed up. that could go off the rails a little bit. So they need to develop this connection, trust this connection's growth, and hopefully it'll be enough to get them into the playoffs and potentially make a little bit of a run as well. Because Terry McLaurin's always going to be a guy who you can't necessarily account for all the time if you're an opposing defense. And the Titans are going to have to learn that as well, because it's not going to be a simple matchup for them either, going up against a physical guy like Terry McLaurin. So look for him to have another decent game. But decency is all you're going to need in this one from Terry McLaurin. And last but not least, A.J. Brown going up against the Ravens in a very interesting game. This time around, it's two interconference teams playing against each other rather than, teams where you're trying to differentiate within your own conference. This could potentially be an intriguing Super Bowl if both teams get there. Eagles-Ravens, man, and what a Super Bowl that would be. But looking at this Eagles team and what A.J. Brown's been doing in it, he's really improved his game. I've been impressed because I've always thought of A.J. Brown as a number one wide receiver who was a little bit too vertical in nature. He's a little bit too straight and narrow. But he developed his route tree. He's getting more expansive of what he can do in different areas of the field. And it's really made him one of the more intriguing weapons from a fantasy perspective down the stretch. And going up against a very interesting Ravens pass defense that can, now we've seen with the Chargers, be pretty potent. It's going to be an intriguing matchup in which Jalen Hurts has to be uber efficient. But knowing A.J. Brown and his connectedness, they're going to have a lot of opportunities for the big play in this one still. The 22.9 fantasy points for LA against LA should ramp up a little bit against the Ravens secondary that I feel can still be exploited even with that performance last night against the Chargers. That's why this game is so intriguing to me down the stretch. But let me know what you think in the comments below. I think that all these receivers are potential big weapons. But coming up next to conclude today's show, my fantasy fact versus fiction for Thanksgiving week. Justifying or debunking big myths potentially coming up in fantasy football circles. We'll be right back to conclude today's show after this short break.